Thanks so much, Joe. So tonight, I want to talk to you about the F word. Now, I know this will be a little uncomfortable for some of us, and I know you're not generally meant to talk about it in polite company as we are tonight, but I truly believe that having this conversation is vital if we want our workplaces to flourish and if we want people to have individual well-being. So I want you to buckle up because we're going to talk about failure. And I promise I'll get you through this safely to the other side. So Winston Churchill famously said that success consists of going from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm. And he describes it so eloquently in this quote that it kind of sounds a little effortless, you know, almost poetic as failure unfolds for us. And I'm not so sure about you, but my personal experience of failure, of which I consider myself quite a master in at this point, be it snapping at my children or some spectacular business failures, as I'll share with you momentarily, is that failure is rarely ever that elegant, really. It's a lot messier and sometimes quite painful as it goes. So what's going on? Is this just me, or do other people have this experience as well? So without getting you to share your stories of failure, can you just raise your hand for me for a moment if failure often feels a little messy, a little painful, something you want to try to avoid if you can? Right, so most of us are in the same boat. And that doesn't really surprise me because, as Dr. Kristen Neff at the University of Texas explains to us, that actually we all make mistakes. We all bump up against our limitations. We all fail at some times. We fall short of our ideals, and to be in this situation is actually what it is to be human. So recently, if you've been feeling that kind of knot in your stomach, the sweat in your palms, the racing heartbeat as you failed at something, let me start by assuring you that you are in good company. In fact, we all experience the F word some of the time, because to be human is to be failing. Now, the good news is that researchers are finding that it's actually what we do with these failures that ultimately determines our success. And in fact, what seems to be particularly important is the way we talk to ourselves during these moments of failure. So I want you to think back perhaps on the last failure you encountered. Might have been something quite big or something much smaller. And as you take yourself back to that moment in time, I want you to think about, how did you respond? What did you say to yourself in that moment? Now, early on in my career, one of my responsibilities was to get publicity in the media for the Royal Melbourne Show. And the Royal Melbourne Show, for those of you who might not be aware of it, of course, is a very friendly, animal-focused family event where the country comes to the city to show us city folks what life is all about on the farm. And so after much negotiating, I convinced the City Council, the police and a group of willing farmers, God bless them, that a perfect picture opportunity to convey this message would be to run 100 sheep down the main streets of Melbourne, where the mayor would wait in the city square to greet them and welcome the country to town. And I'm sure right now, like I was, you're wondering, what could possibly go wrong with this idea? Well, the day finally came when we ran the sheep, and the sun was shining, the sheep were bleating, the dogs were barking, rounding the sheep up, the farmers all relaxed, having a bit of a chat as they strolled down the main street of Melbourne, the mayor waiting excitedly a few blocks on, until we hit the first intersection, where there were some young constables who'd been told to hold back the traffic for a public event, but not told that this public event would involve a mob of 100 sheep that were going to kind of swirl towards them as they increasingly gathered pace, at which point, as these young police officers saw this approaching them, they did what I'm sure most of us would do, and they ran for their lives. And the sheep took off. The sheep took off through the city, through streets we had not blocked, knocking pedestrians over, running in front of trams, running in front of trucks. And probably doesn't need a lot of explaining for you to understand that that night, the first story on the TV evening news was titled, "U-Turn in the City of Melbourne." And as I sat there on my couch watching it, knowing that we had managed to get all the sheep back by that point, that nobody was badly damaged, that we had apologised profusely to the mayor and he'd overcome his disappointment about not getting to welcome the sheep, but that as my heart sank in my stomach that night, as my palms sweated, and my stomach was completely in knots, that feeling of failure. So although everybody in Melbourne knew that the country had come to town, it was certainly not the way I hoped that event was going to go. And perhaps like me, in your moments of failure, you've said something in the past like I did that night, and it went a little bit like this. You stupid, stupid woman. How could you do something so dumb? Now everybody will know you're not really good enough. You are such a loser. And I would love to tell you that the only time I ever speak to myself that way is when I'm facing public humiliation on the front page of The Age, but I hate to tell you that I can do that to myself, be it losing the car keys, publishing a blog with a spelling mistake in it, or standing up and delivering a presentation and realising it's not quite going the way that I hoped. And so again, without asking you to disclose what you might say to yourself in those moments, if any of that sounds familiar, if that voice of criticism fires up when things don't go well for you, can you just raise a hand for me? Yeah, most of us. What I wish I'd said in that moment, that night, was, oh, sweetheart, you poor thing, things didn't quite go to plan there. But you know what, it's okay. You're okay, everybody else is okay, this will be okay. We will learn from this moment. But it's not our first instinct, and there's a good reason why. The truth is that biologically we are wired that when we are under threat, our cortisol and adrenaline fires up, ready to fix or attack whatever it is that's causing us that problem. And when we make a mistake, the issue with this response is that the problem is us. And so we attack ourselves in these moments in an effort to try and protect ourselves. The thing about this voice of inner criticism I've learned is it's not actually trying to harm me. Instead, it's actually trying to protect me. It's just doing it in a very overly zealous and harsh way at times that doesn't always serve me well. It tries to protect me by giving me a boot up the arse to motivate me. Come on, don't be a loser, get in there and fix that. It tries to motivate me by saving me from the pain of deeper emotions like guilt or shame that might actually be very appropriate depending on what that failure is. It tries to save me from the pain of getting criticised by other people. There's nothing you could say to me I haven't already said to myself, I said the next morning when I walked into the office to my boss's angry face. It also tries to protect us by helping us be liked by other people. I know, I'm such a loser, what can you do? And so thinking that it's protecting us, this voice of criticism so often kicks in for most of us. What we often fail to realise though is that although this is well-intentioned, the results are rarely ever actually effective. When we criticise ourselves in this way, we trigger off our brain's self-inhibition systems. And when we do this, when we're trying to protect ourselves and we trigger off that sense of punishment in ourselves, studies have actually found that it makes us less effective in achieving our goals. Think about the negative emotions that inner criticism unleashes and what we know about that, how that narrows in our brain. So we see less opportunities, we're less likely to reach out to other people for help, we tend to isolate ourselves, we're less creative in coming up with solutions to what it is that we've actually failed at. And so studies have found in hundreds of people trying to achieve all sorts of different goals, be it losing weight, academic achievement, improving their relationships, performance at work, that actually when we use this inner critic, it slows our progress down. Think about the stress and anxiety that inner critic creates for you to carry. Like, it's exhausting, right? And instead, we're much less likely to actually reach our goals when we use this inner critic to try and fire ourselves up. So what's the alternative? Well, the good news is, even when your physiological system is kind of firing up, it seems that self-compassion can actually calm it back down. When we use self-compassion, it helps us, instead of trying to tame, blame, or shame these voices of inner criticism, to accept that it's actually trying to protect us, just being a little overzealous today, and that these are stories of self-doubt, of fear and anxiety about what might be unfolding around us, and not the truth of what we're actually capable of. And in these moments of self-compassion, we're able to start talking to ourselves like a wise and kind friend might. We're able to be mindful about the pain that we're experiencing in that moment of failure. We're able to reach out and give ourselves some warmth and support. And we're able to remember that actually we're human, just like everybody else. And that means that we're learning, and at times we're getting some stuff wrong as we go. Now, when we reach for self-compassion, what we've discovered is it triggers oxytocin through our bloodstream. And oxytocin, of course, helps to give us that sense of warmth and support, wanting to tend and befriend and care for ourselves just like we would any other person that we could see suffering in that moment. It also helps to lower our levels of stress down as well. The other thing that self-compassion helps us to do is to balance our perspective of what's actually going on. It helps us to take a step back and see the bigger picture, to recognise that yes, it is embarrassing, and I will probably never live down the day I lost 100 sheep through the middle of Melbourne, but it's not the end of the world. And I did learn from it, and the next few days when I had a choreographed pig show, all the pigs behaved beautifully, and there was still lots of media turning out for that event. So when we tap into self-compassion, we trigger our brain's self-caring and self-awareness systems. And this is really important in terms of giving us a confidence boost, giving us a sense of joy, helping us to lean in and be resilient for different experiences. It helps to lower our sense of self-consciousness. It makes it less likely that we'll compare ourselves to others, and it helps us to feel less insecure. I think it's a beautiful intervention for helping build our self-determination. And for those of you who have studied the work of Richard Ryan and Ed Deci, you'll understand that we all share this deep psychological need to be able to feel confident and capable, to be able to feel connected to other people, that we're not alone in it, and to be able to feel like we can get better at things as we go. So self-compassion, and the research has found now in quite a body of studies that we have to draw upon, has all these beautiful benefits that, far from being soft and about letting ourselves off the hook or somehow excusing it when we don't manage to get the result that we want, that self-compassion actually lets us keep showing up again and again and again, as it gives us a permission to keep learning as we go. So how do we pull it off? Well, there are three very simple components to self-compassion that are available to any of us, no matter where we're working. You don't need permission to try this stuff. You don't even need a budget to be able to pull it off, is the good news. The first is to be able to actually soften by being mindful about when we're in pain. So many of the moments when I've shown up not as the person I want to be, I realise in moments where I've been in pain, but I just didn't realise that was what was happening. And so instead of being able to soften into my body to feel where that pain was occurring and to maybe use touch to give myself a little bit of relief there, I've lashed out, or I've been shorter in temper, or I've lacked self-regulation or emotional intelligence to be able to show up and be the person I'm capable of. And often what happens in this moment where we're not mindful of the suffering or pain we might be experiencing is that we over-identify with whatever's going wrong. We think of ourselves as bad people, little devils, rather than simply saying, you know what, that was probably an overly ambitious goal to try and run 100 sheep down the middle of the main street of Melbourne. Maybe 10 would have done the job next time, right? So using touch is one of my favourite ways to bring myself back into my body and be mindful when I'm needing a bit of self-compassion. And you can do this so discreetly, even just placing one hand on your wrist as you're standing getting ready to present or go into a big meeting, you know, cupping your hands together perhaps as you're sitting in a conversation, are ways to bring some touch to you and some oxytocin back into your bloodstream, particularly if you can just breathe gently as you do it. And what we've seen with touch is even just 7 seconds of that, breathing slowly as you do, just thinking about that ability to soften into the pain rather than bracing against it, can help us to be more compassionate with ourselves. Secondly, we want to be able to speak to ourselves like a wise and kind friend would, to soothe ourselves in that moment of pain. Think what you would do if there was a friend or a colleague in front of you who you could see was suffering and in pain in that moment. Your natural instinct is to go, oh, let's talk about that. What can I do to help? Tell me more. In fact, studies have found that in different populations all over the world, 75% of us, when we're responding with compassion, will go, oh. And so more than the words here, it's actually the tone that you're expressing to yourself. Oh, sweetheart, I know that didn't quite go to plan. It's okay, you're okay, I've got your back. What do we need to do now to improve upon this? And then the third technique for improving self-compassion is to recognise that we are all connected, to allow for our humanness. A few years ago when I was interviewing Carol Dweck about the practice of growth mindsets, she said, you know what, if you get out there and you take a risk and you fail, the worst thing you're going to discover is that you're human, just like everybody else. And I often think of that Thomas Edison quote, I didn't fail, I just found 10,000 ways the light bulb didn't work. And so when I'm in the middle of a good failure now, I think, not up to 10,000 yet, my light bulb could be right around the corner. I'm in good company here. Look who else has failed. And so for me, this is a really beautiful way to pull me back into my growth mindset by reminding myself when I get it wrong, guess what? I'm human just like everybody else, and I'm learning as I go. So again, really small, little everyday practices I find that we can tap into self-compassion. But perhaps like some of the organisations I work with, you might be listening to this going, well, that's well and good, Michelle, but if I rock up in my workplace and start encouraging people to be more self-compassionate, people are going to think I've really gone off to la la land with this positive psychology stuff. So by chance you're needing a bridge to introduce self-compassion more into your work, the good news is I think there are plenty of ways to do it. And while the research is still in its infancy around many of these connections, I don't think you can have grit without having self-compassion. In fact, these days I always teach the two skills together. I don't think you can be resilient without having self-compassion, particularly when you fall down, in order to get back up again. I don't think you can practice acceptance commitment therapy or ACT without self-compassion. In fact, I was interviewing Russ Harris a few weeks ago, and he said ACT and self-compassion are essentially the same thing, they're just coming from different places. But if we look at the business skills that most organisations want, how on earth are you going to drive a culture of innovation if you don't teach people self-compassion as they fail as they go? How can you teach people design thinking if you don't teach them self-compassion for when their designs don't always work out as planned? How can you teach people to rapidly prototype or pilot or do iterative design if you don't teach the skills of self-compassion alongside? So I actually think there are all sorts of ways, both from our positive psychology and wellbeing toolboxes, but also from a basic business need to be able to introduce self-compassion without scaring the natives too much. Most importantly, all of those skills and outcomes are about helping to improve people's behaviour in some way so they can do more of what they do best each day. And so I love this quote from the psychologist Carl Rogers that I think sums up the value of self-compassion best. The curious paradox. Just as I am, then I can change. So if you're looking for more on self-compassion, head over to our website, michellemcquaid.com. We've got a great collection there of different tools, TED Talks, podcast interviews, meditations and things we've been doing with people over the last few months that you can enjoy completely for free. If self-compassion is something maybe you want a little more of for yourself, but for others as well. Thank you so much.